morning sun, how are you? Skies above, gee, it's great to be alive and love.
Okay, hello and good Friday afternoon. I was originally going to do this in the morning, hence my tweet about join me for coffee, but it is now 4:30 Pacific time. Only took me 8+ hours in order to make this happen for various reasons. So anyway, welcome and hope you're having a good day. And today I'd like to share some adventures with Docker and the NavContainerHelper related items. So let's jump into that and see what we have here. Okay, so this, I'd like to mention that Freddy has an awesome new utility called the New-BcContainerWizard. And on his blog post, he explains the background, and I can totally understand it from the user perspective. If you have ever used NavContainerHelper, it has a handful of options, and when I was first using it, I didn't know what options I needed or which options I should choose. I suppose if I had actually read his extensive documentation on the options, that would have helped a lot. But there were a few where I didn't know what choice I should make and whether I should include a parameter or not. Or when a new feature was enabled, there would be a new parameter and I didn't know about it, so I wouldn't think to go check for it. So this New-BcContainerWizard is a very cool PowerShell script. You just type new-BcContainerWizard, and it walks you through the process, asks you questions saying, hey, what type of container do you want? What name do you want? What type of authentication are you going to use? And walks you through that series of questions. And when you're done, it produces a very cool script. If I can switch this. And so with that, once you run through the wizard, it produces a script like this, and it has all of the parameters that you need based on the answers that you provided to those questions. So in this example, I wanted a container named sandbox1, and I wanted to use the username password authentication. And so it has the password there. I chose to use the default admin user. That's one of the options that it provides. And I also chose to save a named image. So you see at the very bottom, or near the bottom, it says image name mybc16. So that was really cool. So I tried that out. I was getting ready to walk through the demo that Eric Hugard recorded the other day about calling a web service. So I was like, neat, let me set up a new container, use this wizard in the process, and learn while I'm doing this. So this is all very cool. However, I got sidetracked, which seems to be a common theme, like today when I was trying to record a video at 8 and now it's 4:30. And so when I ran this script over here, this is what happened. And I thought, wait a minute, I thought I had Docker working well. I thought I had Docker figured out. But for some reason, when I used this script, which is very similar to the one I'd used before, New-BcContainer, it didn't work. So I had this error. My container didn't get created, and I wasn't sure what to do. So I was kind of stumped. New learning opportunity, as one might say. So I'm reading this and thinking, what do I do? So I Googled this. Request is not supported, NavContainerHelper, and I come across a GitHub support issue that has a similar message. The request is not supported was not part of that, but the create compute system error, which you see on this slide here, that was part of that user's error. So after reading that, I thought, well, my issue is similar, but it's not exactly the same. So I submitted my very first GitHub issue for NavContainerHelper. And I looked at the other person's submission, saw how that was done, and I figured out how to submit a GitHub issue. It's new to me, but if you submit a GitHub issue for NavContainerHelper, there is a template that Freddy created, and it shows you, okay, here's what I would like you to submit. Have a thorough description. Submit the full text of the error that you're getting and all the kind of log around that. And then if you're able to, submit the full log. And you can do that with inline text as a code insert, or you can actually attach like a text file. So I've done that as well. So this is an example of my support request. The request is not supported. And I was like, I don't know how to resolve this. So fortunately, within a few hours, Freddy woke up in his time zone and he saw this. And he pointed out, this is strange. It says your host is this version 10 blah, blah, blah. And I thought, well, I don't know what that means. But he explains it's a very old version number, and this is probably the cause. And I thought, well, that doesn't make sense. I have Windows Update running and automatic, and like, I'm sure my Windows is updated, right? Everyone says. Well, I thought, okay, well, you know, he found that number, so let me go check. And what do you know? I went into my Windows server that's running Docker. It's a VM, but it's server 2019, and I thought I'm build 1809. Isn't that current? Well, it turns out it's version 1809, but if I look at the build number, there's this 17763, but then there's these digits at the very end, and those are apparently the significant digits. 1809, kind of meaningless, like whatever. 17763, that's just kind of like a broad build number. What matters, as far as I could tell, are the last few digits. My version was 107. It's a very early build. So I thought, okay, I don't know what that means. Let me look in Windows Update. And Windows Update looked like it was running, but if I scrolled down to the bottom, I saw that there were 2 updates that had failed. And my assumption is those failed updates cause Windows Update to get stuck. And you may have seen this in other scenarios. Those failed updates are like dependencies for subsequent updates. And if those fail, it just causes a train wreck where subsequent updates won't get applied. I hadn't seen any warnings or errors or anything. Maybe there's a notification that could have been set up, but I did not have those set up. And I then pushed through or cleared those failed updates, and I saw, cumulative update for Windows Server 2019 version 1809, and that finally started installing. So now that started happening, I said, okay, this kind of makes sense, and things started to fall into place. So after I got these updates installed, I rebooted, verified my Windows version, and I started poking around. And sure enough, I looked through the full build, the build log from a successful container build where I wasn't using a named image. And I was wondering, well, how did Freddy see which OS version I was using? Well, I looked in the full log that I later submitted, and sure enough, here it is, container OS version, and that's the OS version that the generic container image, the generic image is having to use, was 437, but my host OS version was 107, right there in the NavContainerHelper build log, warning the container operating system matches, but the revision is different. And sure enough, if you encounter issues, you might want to specify isolation Hyper-V. So for the second time now, the Docker or NavContainerHelper had a warning. In my daily usage, there was a warning that I just hadn't seen. It was either suppressed, or in this case, it was flying by as hundreds of lines were going by on screen with NavContainerHelper. So learned a few lessons. Don't assume that Windows Update works. 2, Windows Update and the specific build of Windows is important to NavContainerHelper and Docker and your BC containers. So if you are using a really old version of Windows, there may not be a generic image that is a good match for that, and that may cause subsequent problems. And then the third lesson is review the container build logs, or the NavContainerHelper build logs. Even though it's hundreds of lines, at least scan it and look for warnings or errors. So that was really eye-opening. So I'm kind of glad I encountered this issue. Otherwise, I would just be totally oblivious to what's going on behind the scenes. On the one hand, we want this nice turnkey single button click, zero effort process to get a dev environment, a container build, or whatever. But on the other hand, if we do that, we have no visibility as to what's going on behind the scenes. Now at least I'm like, oh, okay, Windows build specific version is important, and that is a dependency that trickles up and really affects everything that happens subsequently from NavContainerHelper and Docker and the base generic images and artifacts. So very enlightening. So I'm kind of glad I encountered that, even though it burned an entire day, delayed my work on the test project, and resulted in this video. But anyway, it was good learning. So this is much better. Now my Windows is updated and my build number is 1282. And as you'll notice, let me get my head out of the way here. As you'll see now, when I did a successful NavContainer build, Container OS version 1282, that's the generic image that is being used now, and my host OS version 1282, it was able to find an exact match. Everything should be happy. So I now will look for this in the NavContainerHelper build logs and make sure that everything is copacetic and that I don't get any warnings or errors. So really a good learning experience here. So in addition to submitting my issue on GitHub, this was another example which I found interesting. And in this case, it says the paging file is too small for this operation to complete. So when you see that error message kind of at the end of the error, that appears to be the clue that you're looking for. And sometimes it's generic, like in mine, it wasn't very helpful. But here, you at least have a clue. The paging file is too small. Okay, probably relates to the paging file. And if you read this thread on the GitHub issue, you'll see it looks like the user was creating multiple containers. And when you have, say, 5 or 10 or more containers, it actually exhausts the paging file or available memory or whatever that resource was. So that was informative. It's like, okay, great. I need to do this to resolve it. And I'm slowly learning how to understand error messages that occur when using NavContainerHelper working with Docker. So I thought that was pretty cool. And given that, let me jump over to some demo stuff. So I mentioned the new New-BcContainerWizard. So let's take a look at that. So here I am in PowerShell on my Docker VM, which is now updated to the correct Windows version, the latest Windows version. And so this is what that looks like. So I'm going to hit enter, and it walks you through, hey, do you accept the EULA? Yes, I do accept it. And what type of container do you want? Do you want one that is local, or do you want one hosted in Azure? Well, I want local, so I'm just going to hit enter and use the default value of A. And authentication. Do I want username and password? Do I want to use the default of admin with predefined password? Sure, that's good enough for me. I originally used Windows, and there are a few pros and cons of that, but there are some pitfalls to that, and you can get into trouble and not know what's going on if you try to use Windows. So now that I understand that, I can use either, but the basic username password authentication has some simplicity to it, so I now often use that. So I'm going to use default of B. Name of the container, and I'll just call this test. Do I want to use the latest BC sandbox on-prem, or do I want to use a specific version number? Let me just go with the latest. And latest version selected. And what country do I want? I will use the default of US, press enter. Do I want test framework? And sometimes I may want that, but for now it saves time to not have it, so I'm just going to choose D. And do you want the premium plan? No, let's skip that. And I don't want to use a license file or create the test users, and I'm just going to leave the license file blank for simplicity. And then database, Cronus, that's fine. So simple wizard, oh, a few more options, DNS. So I don't yet know which option is best here. I haven't had any network issues in the past, but I don't know what DNS settings were being used by the prior default script. So I assume I was using the default A, but for now, I'm just going to try using my DNS server. So I'm using a Pi-hole DNS server. So for security reasons, let me just use mine. And it's thinking. What's going on here? Okay. And so do I want to use a specific isolation type? And this might be where if I was using an older Windows version and I wanted to use the Hyper-V isolation to try to troubleshoot that or troubleshoot some other problem, I could choose C, but I'm going to let the container decide. Okay. And do I want to save the image? And this is where I chose the named image. So I'm just going to say my image. And there you go. So this is the sample script that it came up with. And I'm going to say, save this to ctemp my test script. Oh, okay. So I typed the name in wrong. But what I can do is I can also just copy this. And so I can have a new window here. And there we go. So in this PowerShell ISE window, I've had my test, username, password, default using the admin and password, and everything is there. So this is a really cool way to just create your new BC container. And I think this is great. As a new user, I would have loved this, and it would have made it much, I guess, less cryptic or less confusing, or lowered the learning curve for me to learn how to use New-BcContainer. So awesome option. There's still some things you need in order to use this. So you need to have NavContainerHelper installed. So you need to go through that step and figure that out. But that's usually 1 or 2 lines in PowerShell. So I thought that was really cool. And now that the image name, the named image is being used, I can say Docker images, and I now have my BC16 image here. I don't know if that shows up, but that is my BC16 image, and that is this specific sandbox version, the US build for my environment. So if I want to create 2 or 3 containers based off of this named image, it, in theory, doesn't have to download anything. It has the full image that it needs. It just spawns a new container off of that image. Now, if I want to do a different say, a different BC version, or I want to do a different localization, I now have my Windows 1282 generic image, and I can do a new container with, say, the W1 image or a 16.2 image, and it'll download the artifacts, either won't build a named image or it will save a named image, whichever you want, to create my new container variant. So really, really cool setup. I love the wizard, all in favor of that. Even if I know what I'm doing, I think I will probably use the wizard going forward because Freddy is constantly updating NavContainerHelper with fixes, new features, new improvements. And I've learned that if I just copy and paste this script that I created, a week ago, a month ago, 6 months ago, time flies and I may not be utilizing some new feature that he's added. So I think going forward, I will update my NavContainerHelper, make sure I have the latest version, and then I will use the wizard to build my new BC container script. So I think that's a perfectly safe way to go. Even if you know exactly what you're doing, a new parameter may be available, just like image name was recently made available. And now if I use the wizard, hopefully those new parameters are available through the wizard, and I don't have to go look and figure out if a new parameter was added. So very, very cool. Anything else I was going to talk about? I think that's it. And so this is the output of that successful build. And so going forward, I'm going to be checking this stuff. And one of the things also that I need to look into is I'm using Docker Engine Enterprise, and I need to look into updating that. I have a slightly older version. So checking my NavContainerHelper version, my Docker version, and my OS version somewhere down here. So there we go. So there's my OS version 1282. It's matching the container generic version or generic container version. And I can see, okay, what's going on here? This is apparently the named image steps. This is where my script previously failed. And then once the image gets created, this is the container build process, I believe, going through all these steps. So now I know, okay, here's a warning. Password that you entered does not mean minimum requirements. Interesting. So when I've done this in the past using the Windows password, if I didn't meet complexity requirements, the login just didn't work. And that's one of the pitfalls of the Windows authentication is I didn't realize that and my login wouldn't work. And I was wondering what's going on. And the same applied to administrator. If I tried to use the administrator user, I couldn't log in. And it took me days to figure out why. And just on a chance, I tried a different password and that resolved it. So this warning, although I suspect this password should work up here, p@ssword, it's not meeting some complexity requirement. So it may want a digit or something else in there. So anyway, hope this was helpful. I learned a ton in the process. I can understand that dealing with this can be very frustrating, but whenever this happens, I just pause and I say, okay, I've been able to do this successfully in the past. Obviously something has changed. I assume I'm doing something wrong or there's something I'm missing. And in this case, I was able to submit a GitHub issue, figured out how to do that. Freddy was very gracious and gentle in pointing out that I had made a mistake and there's something wrong with my environment that was causing the problem. And I looked into it, and sure enough, even though I thought my Windows updates had occurred, they hadn't for a reason with a problem with Windows updates. So it worked out okay. I learned a lot in the process, and now I understand a little bit more about this NavContainerHelper, Docker, a generic image, this entire environment. So really helpful to learn all that. So have a great afternoon, have a great weekend, and hope this was helpful, and I will talk to you soon.
morning sun, how are you? Skies above, Gee, it's